Greetings, nerds, and welcome to part 2 of our 3-part series on the French Revolution. This section will cover the first phase or stage of the French Revolution, the National Assembly. So the first thing you should write on this slide is moderate phase, because it won't be radical-ish. This first phase of the French Revolution, the National Assembly, is going to have this form of a government. Circle it: limited monarchy. So they are going to officially have a version of a constitutional limited monarchy. Not exactly like the one in Britain, but you get the point, close enough. So the actual governing body of France is this legislative body called the National Assembly. We know where that name comes from part 1 of the series. And then we start seeing the rise of these political clubs in Paris, actually throughout France, but largely in Paris. And the most famous one was called the Jacobin, or the Jacobin Club. And basically this club will eventually grow the most radical members of the French Revolution. Eventually this club will actually have a split into a more moderate phase and a more radical phase. But early, we start seeing the rise of these clubs eventually produce these very radical French revolutionary figures like Robespierre later on. So next thing, if you're reading Spielvogel closely, you probably got fairly confused about the National Assembly's name changes. Obviously, we got no National Assembly and National Convention, but during the National Assembly phase, they actually do rename themselves twice, from the Constituent Assembly to the Legislative Assembly. Don't worry about it. Just call it the National Assembly and be done with it. It's just too specific for our needs. So essentially, what to know of the National Assembly is what enlightened reforms are they going to produce first? And really, what elements of the Enlightenment are they going to use as a model for these reforms? So officially, what has happened to King Louis XVI? He is still King of the French. He's not actually King of France, no, he's King of the French. There is a slight difference, being the King of the people as opposed to being King of the country. And he's not an absolutist. Look at that face. No longer an absolutist. Aren't you sad? Oh, poor Louis. Okay. So immediately after the declaration of the National Assembly, the countryside starts engaging in an incredible amount of violence, to the point where they actually call this the Great Fear. So the peasantry, to essentially react towards the nobility trying to reinforce feudal dues, they started in the countryside going to churches, burning down noble houses, because especially with the churches, they were burning down the areas that held actual written records of their feudal dues, and they literally just burnt them to the ground, so there was no evidence that they actually had feudal dues. And basically, when they start murdering nobility, start murdering priests, it's becoming too chaotic way too quickly, and immediately the French National Assembly has to respond to basically assuage these fears and this violence. So by early August of 1789, the National Assembly releases a bunch of reforms, all, look at them, based on the Enlightenment. They remove all forms of feudal privileges, which they've been asking for years. It ended the tithe, great. And this basically stopped the peasants from revolting further, well, for now, I suppose. So that was one of the first significant pieces of chaos in the early part of the French Revolution. Next part. So now we are in the autumn of 1789, and what still hasn't been fixed? Bread prices are still astronomically high. The working class, the sans-culottes, feel like the revolution has not reflected their needs yet. So in October, a mob of largely women, who are the wives of my favorite job ever, fishmongers, got together, and they got some dudes, and they basically marched from Paris to Versailles, which is approximately 12 miles, and they gathered whatever weapons they could find, some guns, some knives, some swords, some pitchforks, and my personal favorite, a legitimate cannon, and they dragged that cannon 12 miles to Versailles, and they set up that cannon, faced it directly at the king's personal apartment in Versailles, and demanded they fix the bread prices, and also demanded that the royal family come back to Paris with the mob. So these women succeeded. The king's guards largely defected or were killed. Actually, the French National Guard, led by Lafayette, was brought in they really were on the side of the revolutionaries, but they were ultimately there to actually preserve the king's life, because they definitely were going to kill the king. And ultimately, they do bring the king, Marie Antoinette, and their son back to Paris. So what's the significance of this women's march on Versailles? One, the king and queen have now just been put under house arrest in the Tuileries Palace in Paris. That means they have literally no political power left. Like, before they were largely king and queen in name, now they have nothing. They still do have the title king and queen, but they have no political power left. Before, at least they had a little bit. Next, what's the importance of this? Clearly, women are taking active roles in the French Revolution. So unfortunately, we're going to see in the French Revolution is politically women will be disenfranchised. They won't be represented by the government, but they have and will take active roles in the French Revolution. The Women's March on Versailles is a great example of the power of women during the Revolution. Great engraving of the Women's March on Versailles. See, I promised you a cannon. All right, moving on. Okay, next, enlightened reform must know. So the next series of notes is just going to go into enlightened reforms of the National Assembly. I would choose maybe 3 of them and really hold on to them. Most important, arguably, is the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. Start, gotta know it. So it was largely written by, yet again, the Marquis de Lafayette, with a little bit of editing by, yes I know, Thomas Jefferson, the author of the Declaration of Independence. And what we're going to see in this document is a bunch of Locke, Voltaire, and Rousseau. So we're going to see that connection between the Enlightenment and the French Revolution. But again, we need to qualify. How enlightened is this? Well, women are not going to be addressed here, and neither are enslaved people. So remember, this is 1789. France still has a significant number of colonies, the most valuable of which was in Haiti, which was called Saint-Domingue at the time. But Haiti was the most valuable sugar plantation in the world, and France is going to hold on to that tightly, at least for now. So, look through this list of rights of the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, and do me a favor and just jot down which enlightened philosopher you think influenced each of these sections. So pause this right now, just jot down John Locke, Rousseau, Voltaire. You could also maybe have multiple people for each section. It's up to you. So do that right now. Let's see how you did. All right, men are born free and equal in rights. Social distinctions may only be founded upon the general good. That sounds a little bit like Rousseau to me. The aim of all political association is the preservation of natural rights of man. Definitely Johnny Locke. Liberty consists in the freedom to do everything that injures no one else. Interesting. I wonder, we could do liberty consists in the freedom to do everything that injures no one else. I think that might be some Rousseau there. Law is the expression of the general will. Yet again, a little bit of Rousseau. No one shall be disquieted on account of his opinions, his religious views. Oh, definitely freedom of speech guy, Voltaire. Free communication ideas, Voltaire again. Since property is an inviolable right, no one shall be deprived thereof except where public necessity. Yeah, that's Locke. Okay. Next, enlightened reform. So this is going to begin a process in the French Revolution where they are going to pretty quickly secularize the Catholic Church and then abolish it, literally abolish it. So in the moderate phase of the French Revolution, the National Assembly, they're going to secularize the church. In the National Convention, the radical phase, they are going to abolish it. They're going to de-Christianize France, at least they will try. So, again, autumn of 1789, the French government has to deal with that spiraling economic debt. The debt didn't just go away. So they pulled a Henry VIII. Remember how Henry VIII dissolved the monasteries, sold it to the English nobility? This is pretty stinking similar. They took the majority of church lands, sold it off, and basically in place of that, they created these bonds called assignats, and these bonds eventually became the de facto, in reality, the currency of France. I actually have 2 of these in my classroom that I'll show you guys once we're back in the room. So first, they've now nationalized the church, sold it off. Then look at what they do with the clergy. The civil constitution of the clergy, I'd give it a star. So they make all Catholic clergy take an oath of allegiance to the French state. Not the Catholic Church, the French state. And then the clergy are getting paid from the state, not the church. Dang, if that's not secularizing the church, I'm not sure what is. All right, next. So some pretty cool reforms are going to complete that still exist today. One of them is they took the feudal boundaries and regions in France and they basically drew roughly like equivalent in population and size. They called them departments, and these departments are still largely the same today. So like the regions of France are called departments. So there's cool. Then they introduced the metric system, which eventually gets adopted in Napoleon's reign in 1799. But France is going to be one of the first countries to use the metric system, based obviously on the zero. And then let's talk about the guillotine. So the guillotine was introduced by Dr. Joseph Guillotin, one of the members of the National Assembly, and it was introduced as a means, as an enlightened reform. Yes, an execution in 1789 is considered a form of enlightenment. So, before the French Revolution, if you were guilty of a capital crime, your execution depended on your social class. So, like, if you were average Joe peasant, committed a capital crime, like, I don't know, stealing, you wouldn't be given an honorable means of execution. You would be hanged. But then if you were a noble who committed a crime that the result is execution, they were given an honorable execution that doesn't bring, like, dishonor to your family. They would hire the most important executioner family in France, the Soissons family, and they would literally make a sword from scratch, sharpen it razor sharp, and then behead you. So the guillotine was meant to have all people who are going to be executed die by the exact same means, and that's equality. And additionally, the guillotine, like, it's a mechanical device. It is almost always going to work. Keyword, almost always. So it was, compared to previous means, very humane. Because, like, hanging, there's a lot of mathematics involved. You have to judge the length of the rope, the person's weight, to make sure that their neck actually snaps. With beheading with a sword, you got to actually hire someone who knows how to use that correctly. A guillotine, you don't need to know how to use it. You just raise the blade and drop it. So the guillotine, as you can find in my classroom, at least a model of it, I'll show you guys once we're back in the room here. So eventually, this guillotine becomes much more prominently used during the National Convention. So give this a read. It's actually pretty cool to show how they're arguing it as a means of enlightened reform. So pause this, give it a read, and let's go. Okay, still on the National Assembly, a key person to know who is going to counter the patriarchy of the National Assembly is Olympe de Gouges. Give her a star. She's definitely got to know of women's participation in the French Revolution. So she looks at the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen and responds to it with her own pamphlet, the Declaration of the Rights of Woman and the Female Citizen. So she basically is taking our old feminist argument and applying it to the French Revolution. She believed that the French Revolution would equally protect men and women because it didn't, and she's arguing to have it happen. She's also, here's a fun fact, one of the earliest prominent advocates of abolishing slavery throughout the French Empire. And this is in, like, the early 1790s, about 1790, 91, she's arguing this. And France will actually be the first major country, Western country, to abolish slavery in 1794 during the National Convention phase. But because Olympe de Gouges was a member of the Girondins, the more moderates in the Jacobin Club, she eventually makes an enemy with the person you should not make an enemy with during the National Convention, Robespierre, and she eventually is guilty of treason and sentenced to the guillotine. Okay, so the next part is the French Revolution. At this point has garnered the attention of the entirety of Europe, Eastern Europe, Western Europe, Central Europe, all of it, the United States as well, because it's so radical. Even though this is the moderate phase of the French Revolution, it's still pretty stinking radical comparatively, right? So some members of the French Revolution want to export the revolution to other parts of Western Europe, and that's where you get countries like Austria, Prussia, who freak out and eventually are going to team up and try and quell the French revolutionaries. But in the meantime, they need to create more unity. So the slogan of the French Revolution, Liberté, Égalité, Fraternité, I apologize for my horrible French accent, liberty, equality, fraternity, meaning brotherhood. Think of, like, frat bros in a college, except not nearly that stupid. And they eventually create a new flag of France. Remember Marquis de Lafayette's cockade, the blue, white, and red. Sorry, my bad. They create that into the new flag of France. That still is the flag to the very day. Check out the hat this guy's wearing. It's called the Firjan. And then you could also see the cockade right on his hat. You can actually find a model of the Firjan in my classroom. If you look at that mannequin that's in the corner, kind of standing up in the room, there's a Firjan on top of it. All right, so the Girondins, let's talk about this group. So the Girondins are going to eventually become the more moderate faction in the Jacobin Club, because the Jacobin Club is going to experience a split. The more radical one will be the Montagnard, the mountain. And they're one of the biggest proponents of exporting the French Revolution to other countries. Okay, so what does Europe think about the French Revolution? Well, overall, it was fairly unpopular, actually. So overall, if you think about who controls most of Europe in the early 1790s, it's still the nobility. So of course it's going to be unpopular. You have a very famous attack on the French Revolution by an Irish Protestant. Ooh, interesting. Remember, Ireland is controlled by Britain at this point in time. Called Reflections on the French Revolution, and look at what he says. France has gone way too far, and eventually the French Revolution will lead to anarchy and eventually dictatorship. It's not funny, haha, more like funny, weird. Yeah, that's a great prediction about Napoleon there, folks. So that guy totally nailed that one on the head in 1790, and Napoleon doesn't become dictator until 1799. All right, so another group, at least to know them vocabulary speaking, is the émigré. So some French nobles who saw the writing on the wall pretty early on got the heck out of France, but with them they took a great deal of French gold. Most of the gold in France was actually owned by the nobility, and that actually is going to lead to a skyrocketing inflation rate. Like those assignats, the de facto currency of the French Revolution, that currency becomes effectively worthless, and they have to keep printing more and more money, which is a constant issue in history. But again, overall, the French Revolution was fairly unpopular with most of Europe. Okay, so now the French Revolution gets attacked. The next scene here, essentially, Austria, Prussia are super mad at the French Revolution because, wait, Marie Antoinette, what was she originally? Oh yeah, she was Austrian. So France actually declares war on Austria because they viewed them as a threat. Basically, France was getting a little bit cocky at this point in time, and they declare war first, and basically they start getting their butt kicked. And as they're getting their butt kicked, the Austrians and the Prussians create the Brunswick Manifesto, and it effectively said, if you touch the royal family, we will burn Paris to the ground. Woo, boy! So what the French Jacobins use, they use this as a means of propaganda. They basically say, look at these evil Austrian Prussians, they want to burn Paris. Well, they use this as a form of rallying and unity, and they basically were able to gather more support for the war, and eventually they actually start winning battles against the Austrians and the Prussians. And eventually, some soldiers in the south of France, from the region of Marseille, well, the city of Marseille, they would be marching to battle singing this song called the Marseillaise. And eventually this song becomes the French national anthem that we are familiar with today. And it is such a fantastic national anthem. It makes the American Declaration of Independence look like the American Star-Spangled Banner look like child's play. If you thought bombs bursting in air was cool, how about slitting the throats of your sons and wives? Yeah. So look up the lyrics of the Marseillaise. They are fantastic. It's just, such a good national anthem. So anyways, the French Revolutionary Wars are going to last from 1792 all the way until 1815. So that includes Napoleon's dictatorship and emperorship. So the wars of the French Revolution, the French Revolutionary Wars, are considerably long. So for the sake of time, I won't watch these, but look it up on your own. La Marseillaise. Okay, now for the fall of the National Assembly, which will lead into the rise of the National Convention. First, overall in the earlier part of the French Revolutionary Wars, France wasn't doing great, and it was leading to dissatisfaction amongst not only the bourgeoisie, but also the lower classes, the peasantry, the sans-culottes. They generally believed that the French Revolution was not being led for their purposes. It was being largely led by the bourgeoisie. Additionally, those Assignats is creating massive amounts of inflation, arguably the worst in French history. So their economy has not gotten any better. Hard currency, which often boosts the economy, is gone. So like it's not really gotten any better, even though they've changed the government. So overall, the National Assembly is losing popularity quick. Okay, so just before we switch into the National Convention, there's a wave of considerable violence in Paris called the September Massacres, where basically the working class are going into the prisons and they are just like eliminating people in the prisons. They killed over 2,000 people who they perceive to be quote unquote counter-revolutionaries. Give that a circle for me. This is a term that will come up quite a bit in AP Euro. We'll talk about it quite a bit with the Soviet Union. They always labeled people as counter-revolutionaries during Stalin's dictatorship. So this idea of people who are labeled as political opponents, people who are against the revolution, and frankly, anybody can be labeled a counter-revolutionary. It just is a matter of, are you in the wrong place at the wrong time in some cases. So the Jacobins have now experienced a split. So the Jacobins are now the Girondins and the Montagnards, the mountain. Star circle, underline them. Gotta know the mountain. They will eventually lead the National Convention, and some prominent Montagnards to know: Robespierre being number one, George Danton, look at that beautiful face there, and my fellow alumnus from St. Andrews University in Scotland, J.P. Marat, who was actually a doctor at the time, and eventually is an editor of prominent French revolutionary newspaper, are going to be the three key leaders of the Mountain faction. Okay, so we have the split. The Girondins, largely, this is really the key note on why they split. The Girondins still wanted to maintain the limited monarchy. They wanted to keep a king of the French, but largely have powers in the National Assembly. But the Mountain, they want a flat-out Republican government. Please note, this is a small r Republican. When you see small r Republican, it means you just want a republic. It is not the modern-day American Conservative Party. It's Republicans. They want a republic. So that means remove the entire creation of the king. Like, gotta be gone. So why are they called the Mountain? So they specifically sat in the highest seats in the meeting area of the National Assembly. So they were like on the mountain of the National Assembly. And largely the Mountain was dominated by the people who represented Paris, and Paris was undeniably the most radical portion of France during the Revolution. And they gained power because they're supported by the Sans-Culottes. And the Sans-Culottes are really becoming violent at this point in time. So here's also a little fun fact. Have you ever heard someone describe like politics in a left to right spectrum? Like, ooh, that person's a leftist or a rightist. Leftist being liberal, rightist being conservative. That actually begins in the French Revolution, because the more like liberal, radical factions in the French Revolution sat literally on the left-hand side in the National Assembly, and the more conservative ones sat on the right-hand side. And that left-right dichotomy was created. There's your fun fact. Okay, so 1791. What is the king and queen doing? So we are still in the National Assembly. Well, for a while now, they've been under house arrest since 1789 after the Women's March in Versailles. And Marie is like going to Louis, hey Louis, can we please leave? Can we please leave? Can we please leave? Can we go to Austria? And you're thinking, wait, Austria is like kind of far from France. It's actually not. So look up a map of Paris right now and look for where Belgium is comparatively to Paris. It's pretty stinking close. And guess who owns modern-day Belgium at this point in time? Austria. It was the Austrian Netherlands. So they're going to try and eventually Marie does convince Louis to try and get the heck out of Paris, and they're going to try and flee to the Austrian Netherlands, and this will be called the so-called Flight to Varennes. So the royal family, they know they can't like disguise themselves as peasants or sans-culottes, because they're too clean, they're too well fed, they just can't pull it off. So they disguise themselves as very rich, like bourgeoisie. And they get into a carriage, and they're disguised. So off they go, and they make it through multiple police checkpoints, and they are right on the border of the Austrian Netherlands. And they make an unplanned stop, because Louis had to do something, apparently. And they go through one last police checkpoint. And the soldier looks in the carriage, looks directly at Louis XVI's face. He's like, oh, okay. And he says, all right, you guys can go. And off they go. And then the soldier goes back into his little like outpost, and he's looking at one of those paper money, the assignat, and on the face of the paper money is literally the face of Louis XVI. It's like, oh crap, that was the king! Because at that point in time, most people could not recognize the king and queen of the country because, you know, there's no TV at that point in time. He's like, oh dang! So they call in more soldiers, the French National Guard come in, they stop the carriage just before the border, and they capture the royal couple, and they are sent back to Paris. So think about how this looks. The king and queen of France have tried to flee to literally the enemy of France, Austria, because they are still fighting a war against them. That's not a good look. That is a great piece of evidence to declare someone guilty of treason later on. Hint, hint, nudge, nudge. Okay, so now we are in late August into early September 1792. The National Assembly dissolves itself because they frankly cannot govern when they have an untrustworthy monarch, and the National Convention takes over, and one of their very earliest actions is to put the king on trial, or should I say, former king. All right, so on that point, I'm going to stop this right here, and then part 3 will be the National Convention and the Directory. So thanks for listening.